Chapter 9 Apology to Iris. Brian's apology tour, 1810 edition, began in the library with Lady Patten. Alice had made clear that he was going to have to make an effort to apologize to each of the women he'd been rude to in the breakfast room, and he was just grateful that there had been only 3 of them. He hadn't been looking for this particular lady on purpose, and wasn't even sure if he knew her name, having heard it once before, but when he discovered her reading by herself in a room full of books, he was confident he wouldn't be quizzed on the details if he was charming enough during the apology portion of the event. Brian thought he could be charming, especially in a library. The library itself did not disappoint. It had books aplenty, shelves of them clearly purchased by the yard. There was plenty of natural light from numerous windows, but inexplicably, on this side of the castle, the usually persistent sea breeze was nowhere to be felt. The curtains, in turn, had ceased their perpetual billowing. The place was bright and spacious, with a number of pieces of comfortably elegant furniture, and in the very room sat Lady Iris herself. Brian couldn't help but notice, now that he was no longer possessed by the spirit of demon theater, that Iris was actually quite good-looking in a way that reminded him of a classic marble statue. Beautiful, but aloof, an impression in no way softened by the attention she was clearly focusing on the book in her hand. He stepped into the room, but the lady did not look up. Brian stood uncertainly in the doorway for a moment, not entirely sure how to break the silence, and had a sneaking suspicion that the woman had been waiting for him, or someone, to discover her there. While she held the book in her hands, she looked more like someone who wished to be seen reading, rather than someone who was absorbed in the printed page. One scarcely needed the stage direction. Curtain rises as a well-heeled lady sits perched on a sofa, gazing upon a book. Brian attempted an air of good humor. "Oh, there you are," he said, congratulating himself on starting things off more or less normally. "Yes," Lady Patten said in an expressionless voice, without even bothering to look up. She turned a page of her book. It was not the best of beginnings. "What do you have there?" Brian plowed ahead. "This?" Iris lifted her eyes from the page to carefully examine the front and back covers from several angles. "This is a book," she said, and opened it to where she had left off and turned another page with quiet precision. Brian regarded her thoughtfully. It seemed unlikely she'd had the time to read all the way to the bottom of the next page already. It was clear that she was reading the book at him as a rebuke, and not in the least interested in the book itself, although it was, in fact, the current bestseller, Journal of John Wilkes' Travels in Egypt up to the Pyramids of the Nile. Now that Brian was on the receiving end of demon theater, for once he realized he would have to recalibrate his approach. The room remained silent, except for the very clear sound of Lady Iris turning another page. Brian shifted his weight uneasily, and the floor groaned a little. "A book. Yes, well put," he said, attempting to find a joke somewhere in the situation. He brightened as inspiration struck. "Well, 'tis a library after all. This place is just crawling with books. Ha ha ha! Yes, look at all of them. Yes, ha! His jolly laugh fell flat even in his own ears. Lady Iris lifted her glance from the book and let the silence after Brian's joke linger. After a suitably tortuous amount of time had elapsed, she decided to turn another page without even looking at the book. Indeed, she said coolly, a library. In England, they are meant to be places for quiet study. Is it different in the colonies? No, it's the same there too, Brian said, with a dawning awareness that he was being skewered by an expert. I thought so, she said. The Empire spends so much time and effort in its attempts to bring civilization to the wilderness, I would hate to think it was going to waste. Brian couldn't help feeling just a tiny bit relieved when she went silent, and then, with a graceful gesture, Lady Patton turned another page, smoothed it down, and continued to read. He realized he was still in disgrace. Duly chastised and remembering his sister's lecture had included important advice about shutting up and listening occasionally, Brian moved over to a bookcase and opened up a random volume in a way that looked, he hoped, like he was a serious library patron. For a few minutes, he and Lady Iris did nothing but pretend to absorb literature, turning pages at random intervals and saying nothing at all. Anyone without eyes could see the lady was absolutely not noticing Lord Latimer. Her attention seemed to be clearly focused on the new page, which was, in fact, a rather tedious description of an Egyptian felucca boat. Brian, on the other hand, was very conscious of Lady Iris and was scarcely even bothering to look at his text as he turned pages. It was becoming clear that he was in the presence of a true master of the cold shoulder. He needed to apologize to her, and clearly she was not going to go out of her way to make his job any easier. He would have to be the one to talk if any apology were to be made any time this century, as he had already experienced 2 centuries and he had no desire to go into a diabetic coma while waiting around for a third. He decided he'd better work his way towards breaking the ice. Brian cleared his throat and, closing his book, he turned to Iris and asked, "Might I ask what book you find so fascinating?" There was the slightest of pauses as Lady Patton presumably weighed the decision of whether to turn another page. "It is a book of manners, Lord Latimer." Associates of hers would have known she was well pleased with the implied barb by the slight tightening of her lips as she once again turned from one unread page to another. Brian's book, chosen at random, 15 sermons preached on several occasions by the most Reverend Father in God, John, Lord Bishop of York, Primate of England, and many other things too tedious to type, 1709, caused the shelf to groan as he put it back. "That does sound interesting," he said. She said. It wasn't much of a response, But before she could turn another page in his direction, Brian was quick to ask, "I wonder, does it happen to say anything about impromptu theatricals by deranged hosts?" He was watching her closely and thought a slight tightening about her eyes might have been the beginnings of a smile, quickly suppressed. He took that as encouraging. "No," she replied, "but I have yet to finish the book." "Good thing you are such a fast reader," said Brian, risking a bit on his interpretation of her reaction. "There must be at least 400 pages there." She was definitely fighting not to smile at him. "Yes, it is quite comprehensive." She turned a page. "But if such theatricals as I recently witnessed should happen to be mentioned, I feel certain they are not recommended." "No?" said Brian, all playfulness gone for the moment. "No, I'm sure you're right. I'm sorry that you feel the need of such a book. I came to apologize." Lady Iris closed her book and finally met his gaze. "I lost my head, and my sister says I was very rude." "You were," agreed the lady. "Then I'm sorry," Brian said, and he meant it. He gave a smile that was much more genuine than the one he'd entered the breakfast room with, and much less aggressively cheerful. He even bowed a little bit. It seemed appropriate. "I apologize," he said, "and hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Lady Patten bowed her head, that graceful, well-trained gesture of hers that was like a curtsy without being one, and taking it as a sign of agreement, he felt a rush of relief. "Well," said Brian, briskly clapping his hands together, "needless to say, when you do find the theatrical chapter, would you do me the honor of bringing it to my attention?" Her eyes drew together in a slight frown. "For what purpose, my lord?" she asked. "So that I can learn how to do better," he said. Now it was his turn to be a bit amused, as she said, "Would you accept a rebuke, my lord?" Brian didn't try to hide his smile. "I love rebukes. You should have been privy to the lecture I just got from my sister," he said lightly. "But I am not your sister, my lord." Her tone was even and carried none of the lightness that Brian had been going for. Clearly, she was not in the mood to be diverted. "It doesn't matter who you are. If what you say makes sense, it makes sense. If I acted terribly, you have every right to tell me so." Brian tried to match her tone. Remarkable. Something had changed in her expression, though Brian didn't know Lady Iris well enough to guess what exactly had caused the change. He was only conscious of having her full attention. She murmured, almost to herself, "One can admire the chivalry that made him want to defend the honor of a hapless child, if not the means by which it was expressed." Then she drew a deep breath and declaimed, "Lord Latimer, I have no choice but to tell you that you did indeed act terribly." He braced himself, expecting to be given a lecture in deportment from an expert in the art, but she surprised him. "In your melodrama. I've been to the theater before, and never have I seen a performer less worthy to tread the boards." Brian exploded in laughter and relief. He was glad to be back in more familiar territory. "Well, wait a minute," he protested. "I didn't have my coat. It's a great coat. You should have seen me in the coat." Costuming was not the problem. Lady Patten insisted. Her eyes were twinkling even if her words were severe. She was beginning to enjoy herself as she relaxed into the role of the critic. Not content to give us one dismal character reeking of no special distinction, she pronounced, you saw fit to inflict 3 characters on us, each more insipid than the last. She seemed almost giddy, and he wondered if this was the first time she had ever been able to give her real opinion about something to a man of her class, without having to worry about the social consequences. She continued, your villain was a bloodless, lusterless creature reeking of no more danger than a slug. Your heroine was insipid and no more attractive than my maiden's aunt soiled boot. And your hero, Brian laughed but still tried to defend himself. You really do need to see me do it in the coat. She looked ready to laugh with him. The problem was not the fabric, she decreed, brushing aside his defense with a slight sniff and a flick of the wrist. It was the performance. Never had the stage seen such a dead weight, a molten iron falling to the floor to remain hopelessly unforged, a dense mass, unmoving and unmovable. The real tragedy of the play was that it was witnessed by those whose only offense was to be trapped in the breakfast room that morning. Brian laughed and applauded. Lady Iris looked a little startled at her outburst, and her public persona, the dignified socialite, flooded back. Forgive me, Lord Latimer. I can assure you that I am not usually so forthright in my opinions, and would have escaped back to the unread pages of her book. But Brian quickly reassured her. No, that's quite all right. I asked for that, he continued in evident good humor. It's not the worst review I've ever had. Might have been the one with the widest vocabulary, though. Brian smiled. In turn, allow me to tell you I think you have the makings of a fine critic. Thank you, my lord. Lady Iris seemed grateful for the chance to recover her poise. Now, you have told me what you think of my acting. Brian assumed his acting pose, one hand pointed across his belly and the other hand pointed at the ceiling. Now, tell me what you think of my writing. He shifted his pose so that the upright hand now mimed writing, and the other hand now artfully stroked his chin. Lady Patten gave her first genuine laugh. This was nothing like the practiced musical ripple she'd graced them with at the breakfast table, but Brian liked it much better. She rose from her chair and assumed what was clearly meant to be a scholarly pose. Well, Lord Latimer, there is a certain economy to your language that is parsimonious in the extreme, but the words you do use are quite effective, she declared. Especially telling is your use of the words pay and rent. Her harsh words and overly pretentious tone of voice were belied by the smile on her face. She was clearly having fun. Brian looked up from his air writing. Some say I rival Shakespeare himself these days, he suggested diffidently. If the bard himself were here, my lord, I am sure he would cede the floor to your brilliance, Iris proclaimed as if to a lecture hall. Like him, she was grinning widely. You are too kind, my lady. Brian performed a bow with a flourish of hand-waving. Lady Patten applauded. Of course, the bard is dead, my lord. These days, she reminded him archly. But when one has the talent such as yours, my lord, one must seize any possible advantage. Brian laughed and clutched an imaginary dagger that had been stuck in his chest. A hit, a most palatable hit. He staggered about the library, his fist held over his heart. That too, my lord, is also from the bard. Lady Iris couldn't help but observe with a smile. Out, damn Spot. Brian had once again succumbed to his muse, but this time his audience didn't seem to mind. He manfully struggled to pull out the invisible dagger. A dagger named Spot? That's you, I'm afraid, Iris said, laughing. I confess, when I was at school, we undertook amateur theatricals. I always preferred Hamlet to Macbeth. One sympathizes with poor Ophelia. Then, all at once, to Brian's delighted surprise, Iris assumed a willowy pose, one hand draped over her brow in the tragic method approved by Demon Theatre. Nay, I will not go to the nunnery, she said, the words implying Shakespeare's works, but the tone clearly harked back to Brian's breakfast time performance. You must! Brian did his best to loom villainously. Go to the nunnery. Mwahaha! I shan't go to the nunnery, she stamped her foot. Death before the habit. Happy dagger, find a home. She mimed, stabbing herself gruesomely, and wilted with true artistic grace back into the chair. What dagger was that? Whispered Brian, even as he suspected he knew the answer. Without opening her eyes, Iris whispered back, 'Twas Spot, the happy dagger. They both laughed. In that case, Brian struck a pose, looking as heroic as it was possible to be without a greatcoat. I will go to the nunnery. He paused and extended to help Lady Iris rise, still giggling from the chair. Brian frowned and broke character. Actually, that is a happy ending for Whiplash, he said in a serious, puzzled tone. Dudley is off to the nunnery, and our villain is left with Nell. Iris laughed again, that genuine laugh that Brian liked. Perhaps we shall find that Whiplash is not nearly as villainous as he first appeared, she said diffidently, and Brian found himself hoping that she was encompassing more than the melodrama in that sentence. Looking into her eyes, he opened his mouth and found himself blurting the truth. I'm not from this place. I'm not from this time even. I'm from the future. Lady Iris, flushed from the excitement of Demon Theatre, seemed only to consider his line in the context of the silly play. My lord, I have not enjoyed myself so much in ages. If you be mad, and this be your madness, I will enjoy the method of it. The play, after all, is the thing. Brian realized that somehow Alice had been right after all. Honesty really was the best policy. His apology had been accepted, and in spite of a bumpy start, it had gone really well. He almost couldn't wait to get out of there and try out his skill on another insulted lady.